My wife texted, "I want someone better than you," and asked for divorce, but in court, I secretly set a trap that made her dirty plan collapse. My name is David, and I'm about to tell you the story of how my 7-year marriage ended with a single text message, and how that moment changed everything I thought I knew about the woman I'd been sharing my life with. It was a Tuesday morning in October when my phone buzzed at exactly 9:47 a.m. I was sitting in my home office reviewing quarterly reports for the accounting firm where I'd been working for the past 5 years. The message was from Sarah, my wife. "David, I want a divorce. I can't do this anymore. I'll pick up my things this weekend." I stared at the screen for maybe 30 seconds, reading it 3 times. No explanation, no attempt at conversation. Just a cold, clinical announcement delivered like she was canceling a dinner reservation. After 7 years of marriage, 26 months of trying to have children, and countless conversations about our future together, this was how it ended. Most men would have called immediately, demanded explanations, maybe even rushed to her office downtown where she worked as a real estate agent for high-end properties. But something about the tone of that message, so calculated, so final, made me pause. Instead, I typed back a single word, "Okay?" I set the phone down and went back to my spreadsheets. The funny thing is, I wasn't even surprised. Not really. The Sarah who sent that message wasn't the same woman I'd married 7 years ago in a small ceremony at her parents' house in Ohio. That Sarah had been warm, spontaneous, and genuinely happy with our modest but comfortable life in our 2-bedroom house in suburban Denver. She used to joke about my methodical nature, calling me her steady Eddie, while she provided the excitement and adventure. But over the past 8 months, something had shifted. It started when she joined Morrison & Associates, one of those boutique real estate firms that catered to clients with more money than sense. Suddenly, our conversations were filled with talk about luxury cars, designer handbags, and vacation homes in Aspen. She started working late more often, attending networking events that seemed to happen every other night, and developing friendships with people whose names I only heard in passing. The most significant change came through her new best friend, Jessica Martinez. Jessica was everything Sarah seemed to want to become. Polished, wealthy, married to a tech executive who showered her with expensive gifts. Sarah would come home from their lunch dates at places like the Capitol Grill with shopping bags from stores we'd never been able to afford, claiming they were investments in her professional image. When I questioned the credit card statements showing charges of $400 for a single blouse or $800 for shoes, Sarah would get defensive. "You don't understand the real estate business, David," she'd say, her voice taking on this new, slightly condescending tone I'd never heard before. Image matters when you're dealing with clients who have 7-figure budgets. The woman who used to be perfectly content with our Saturday morning farmers market trips and movie nights at home now seemed restless, constantly scrolling through Instagram accounts of lifestyle influencers and luxury travel bloggers. She'd show me pictures of penthouse apartments and exotic vacations with this wistful expression as if our life together was somehow insufficient. I tried to adapt. I suggested we take a nicer vacation that summer, maybe splurge on a weekend in California wine country, but it wasn't enough. Nothing seemed to be enough anymore. Sarah had developed this hunger for a lifestyle that my steady $58,000 annual income couldn't provide, and she made sure I knew it through subtle comments and not-so-subtle sighs. The breaking point came 3 weeks before the divorce text. Sarah announced she was going to Las Vegas with Jessica and some other women from the real estate office for a business conference. The conference part might have been true, but the pictures she posted on social media showed expensive dinners, very important person club access, and shopping sprees that would have blown our monthly budget twice over. When she came back, she was different, distant. She moved through our house like she was already living somewhere else in her mind. Our conversations became transactional, bills to pay, schedules to coordinate, basic household maintenance. The warmth that had sustained us through 7 years of marriage had evaporated, replaced by this cold efficiency that made me feel like a roommate she barely tolerated. Now, sitting in my office with her divorce text still glowing on my phone screen, I realized that Sarah hadn't just decided she wanted out of our marriage. She'd been planning this exit strategy for months, carefully building her new identity while systematically dismantling the emotional connection we'd once shared. The text wasn't impulsive. It was calculated, probably composed with Jessica's input during one of their expensive lunch meetings. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Sarah. "I hope we can handle this maturely. I think it's best for both of us." I looked at that message and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Clarity. The woman I'd married would never have handled something this important through text messages. The woman I'd married would have sat down with me, probably over coffee at our kitchen table, and talked through whatever problems we were facing. This new version of Sarah, the one who measured her worth by her proximity to wealth and status, was a stranger wearing my wife's face. I picked up my phone and typed back, "Whatever you think is best, Sarah." Then I did something that would prove to be the most important decision I'd make in this entire situation. Instead of wallowing or calling my friends to complain, I opened my laptop and researched divorce attorneys in Denver. By noon, I had consultations scheduled with 3 different lawyers for that same week. After 7 years of marriage, I'd learned a few things about my wife. Sarah was impulsive, driven by emotion, and terrible at thinking through the long-term consequences of her decisions. She was also convinced that I was predictable, passive, and would handle this divorce the same way I handled everything else in our relationship, by being accommodating and putting her needs before my own. She was about to discover that she'd dramatically underestimated the man she'd been living with for 7 years. The same methodical nature that made me good at my job, the same attention to detail that had built our financial security, and the same strategic thinking that had gotten us through previous challenges was about to be focused on protecting myself in ways Sarah couldn't imagine. I had a feeling this was going to be a very interesting weekend. That evening, Sarah came home around 7:30, which had become her normal time since starting at Morrison & Associates. She walked through the door with her usual confident stride, designer purse slung over her shoulder, car keys jingling in her manicured hand. If she was nervous about the divorce bombshell she'd dropped that morning, she certainly didn't show it. "Hi," she said, not quite meeting my eyes as she headed straight for the kitchen. "I'm just going to grab some things for dinner. Jessica and I are going to discuss the logistics of everything." "Of course you are," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Take your time." She paused at the refrigerator door, probably expecting more of a reaction. When I simply went back to reading on my tablet, she continued gathering items with more noise than necessary, clearly trying to provoke some kind of response. After 15 minutes of aggressive cabinet slamming, she left without another word. What Sarah didn't know was that her departure gave me the opportunity I'd been waiting for. 3 months earlier, when she'd started acting secretive about her phone, I'd casually asked our neighbor's teenage son to help me set up a family sharing plan for our iCloud accounts. For emergencies, I told Sarah, and she'd agreed without paying much attention to the technical details. That night, I accessed our shared photo stream and message backups. What I found was worse than I'd imagined, but also exactly what I needed. The first discovery was a group chat called Operation Fresh Start between Sarah, Jessica, and 2 other women I didn't recognize. The messages went back 4 months and read like a strategic planning session for ending marriages. Jessica's role as the ringleader was clear from the beginning. "Girls, life is too short to settle for mediocre men with mediocre incomes. We deserve better." Sarah's contributions to this conversation made my stomach turn. "David is so predictable. He'll probably cry and beg me to stay, maybe offer couples therapy. He has no idea what's coming." Another message from 2 weeks ago. "Jessica's right about getting my finances in order first. I've been moving money to a separate account gradually. He's so trusting he never checks anything." But the most damaging evidence was in Sarah's private messages with Jessica. Screenshot after screenshot of our bank statements, photos of our tax returns, even pictures of my business documents from my home office. Sarah had been systematically documenting our assets and sharing them with Jessica, who was apparently helping her plan the most advantageous way to file for divorce. One exchange from last week made everything crystal clear. "Jessica, remember, you want to be the one who looks reasonable. File first, claim irreconcilable differences, and ask for temporary spousal support while the assets are divided." "Sarah, what about the house?" "Jessica, Colorado is a no-fault state, but judges like wives who seem cooperative. Ask for the house and half his retirement accounts. He'll probably agree to avoid conflict." "Sarah, and if he doesn't? Jessica, trust me, men like David always cave when they realize how expensive lawyers are. Plus, all his financial weaknesses. He's been so focused on building that emergency fund he won't want to drain it on legal fees." Reading those messages felt like watching a recording of my own murder being planned. The woman I'd shared a bed with for 7 years had been treating our marriage like a business deal gone bad, calculating the most profitable exit strategy with the cold precision of a corporate raider. But Sarah had made one critical miscalculation. She assumed I was the same man who'd been steamrolled by her increasingly demanding behavior over the past year. She thought that David, who'd quietly absorbed her criticism about our lifestyle, who'd worked overtime to pay for her expensive professional wardrobe, who'd never questioned her mysterious late nights and weekend trips, would continue being that same accommodating pushover during our divorce. She was wrong. The next morning, I was sitting in the office of Margaret Chen, one of Denver's most respected divorce attorneys. At exactly 8 a.m., Margaret was in her early 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that comes from 25 years of dealing with acrimonious divorces. "Mr. Anderson," she said after reviewing the printed copies of the messages I'd brought, "your wife has made several significant errors in judgment. First, documenting your assets and sharing them with a third party could be considered a breach of fiduciary duty. Second, the systematic movement of marital funds to separate accounts is something judges take very seriously." "What are my options?" I asked. Margaret smiled grimly. "More than she thinks you have. Colorado allows you to request temporary restraining orders on all marital assets. We can freeze bank accounts, credit cards, and prevent any major financial decisions until the divorce is finalized. Given this evidence, I'm confident we can get those orders by Friday." "How quickly can we move?" "If you're serious about this, I can have paperwork filed by noon today. The beauty of your wife's strategy is that she's been so focused on planning her exit. She hasn't considered how vulnerable her current position actually is. Those expensive lunches and shopping trips? If she's been using marital funds for unnecessary expenses while planning to divorce you, that's dissipation of assets. A judge won't look kindly on that." By Thursday afternoon, everything was in motion. Margaret had filed for temporary restraining orders on all our accounts, citing Sarah's documented plan to hide marital assets. She'd also requested an emergency hearing based on evidence of financial misconduct. More importantly, she'd prepared documents that would legally require Sarah to account for every dollar she'd spent from our joint accounts over the past 6 months. The restraining orders were granted by Friday at 2 p.m. By 3 p.m., I'd contacted our bank and credit card companies to implement the court orders. By 4 p.m., I'd changed the locks on our house, something Colorado law allowed me to do since both our names were on the mortgage, and I could prove I was the primary resident paying all household expenses. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and Sarah's laptop, which she'd conveniently left behind in her rush to have dinner with Jessica. Her browser history told an interesting story: luxury apartment listings in downtown Denver, expensive car dealerships, and dating websites where she'd already created a profile using photos from her recent Vegas trip. Her email account revealed even more damning evidence: correspondence with a divorce attorney who'd apparently told her she could expect significant spousal support and at least half of all marital assets, messages with apartment leasing offices about deposits and credit checks. Most tellingly, an email exchange with a financial advisor about optimizing her divorce settlement for tax purposes. Sarah had been planning this divorce for months, treating it like a lucrative business venture. She documented our assets, moved money, consulted attorneys, and even started looking for her post-divorce lifestyle, all while I was working overtime to pay for her expensive tastes and believing we were working through a rough patch in our marriage. But her biggest mistake was underestimating the man she'd been lying to for months. The same attention to detail that made me successful in accounting, the same methodical approach that had built our financial security, was now focused on protecting myself from her calculated betrayal. My phone rang at exactly 6:30 p.m. It was Sarah, and she sounded panicked. "David, what did you do?" "My credit card was declined at dinner, and Jessica says her card was declined too. The bank says our accounts are frozen." "That's correct," I replied calmly. "I received a court order today freezing all marital assets pending our divorce proceedings. I'm sure your attorney will explain the details to you." "What attorney?" "David, what the hell is going on?" "Check your email, Sarah. You should have received copies of all the court documents by now. I'll be staying at the house, as the court has designated me the temporary resident. You'll need to find other accommodations until we work out the details." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. "David," she finally said, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in months, "can we talk about this like adults? I'm sure we can work something out without lawyers and court orders." "I think that ship sailed when you started planning this divorce 4 months ago while taking pictures of my business documents," I replied. "My attorney will be in touch with yours to schedule a meeting." "Have a good evening, Sarah." I hung up the phone and took another sip of my coffee. Outside, the autumn sun was setting over the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe clearly. Sarah was about to learn that the man she'd been taking for granted was full of surprises. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that usually made Sarah want to spend the day hiking in the foothills. Instead, I watched from my home office window as her silver BMW pulled into our driveway at exactly 9 a.m. She sat in the car for several minutes, probably steeling herself for what she assumed would be a confrontation, where she could manipulate me back into being the accommodating husband she'd grown used to. When she finally approached the front door, I heard her key slide into the lock, followed by confused jiggling, then more aggressive attempts. After about 2 minutes of this, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Sarah standing on our front porch with 2 large suitcases and an expression I'd never seen before. Genuine uncertainty mixed with the first hints of real fear. "David, my key doesn't work," she said, trying to maintain her usual confident tone, but not quite succeeding. "That's correct," I replied. "The locks were changed yesterday as part of the temporary court orders. This is now considered my primary residence until our divorce proceedings are complete." She stared at me like I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "David, this is ridiculous. It's my house too. We can work this out without all this legal drama." "Actually, we can't," I said, pulling out my phone to show her the official court documents. "Judge Morrison issued temporary restraining orders on all marital assets, including this house. I'm legally designated as the primary resident since I'm the one who's been paying the mortgage, utilities, and maintenance for the past 3 years while you've been spending our money on designer clothes and expensive dinners." The color drained from her face as she read the legal documents. "You can't be serious. Where am I supposed to live?" "I assumed you'd stay with Jessica," I replied. "You two seem to have planned everything else together." That's when I saw the first crack in her composure. Her perfectly manicured hands started shaking slightly as she scrolled through the court orders on my phone. "David, you don't understand. I can't. Jessica's husband is... It's complicated." "I'm sure you'll figure something out," I said. "You've become very resourceful over the past few months." She tried several more approaches. Tears, anger, attempts at seduction, promises to work things out, but I remained politely unmoved. Finally, she gathered her suitcases and left, but not before trying one last manipulation. "You're going to regret this, David. I know things about your business that could cause problems for you." "I'm sure you do," I replied. "Just remember that threatening your spouse during divorce proceedings is something judges take very seriously." "Have a good day, Sarah." After she left, I called Margaret Chen to report the interaction. "Document everything," she advised. "Her behavior is following a predictable pattern. First denial, then bargaining, then threats. The anger phase is coming next." She was right. The messages started that afternoon. 2:15 p.m. "David, I'm staying at a hotel. This is insane. Call me so we can talk like reasonable adults." 2:47 p.m. "My credit cards aren't working. The bank says the accounts are frozen. How am I supposed to buy food?" 3:23 p.m. "This is harassment. You can't just cut me off financially. I have rights." 4:18 p.m. Jessica's attorney says what you're doing is illegal. You're going to be in serious trouble. 5:50 to 2 p.m. David, please. I'm sorry about the text message. I was emotional. We can fix this. I didn't respond to any of them. Margaret had been clear, document everything, but don't engage in emotional conversations that could be used against me later. By Sunday, the messages were coming every hour. 8:15 a.m. I had to use the emergency credit card to pay for the hotel. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? 9:33 a.m. Jessica says her husband is asking questions about our friendship. I can't stay with them anymore. 11:47 a.m. The hotel is asking for a different card. All of ours are being declined. What did you tell the bank? 1:22 p.m. This is financial abuse, David. I'm documenting everything for my attorney. 2:55 p.m. I'm at McDonald's because it's all I can afford. Are you happy now? 4:18 p.m. My parents are asking why I'm not answering their calls. What am I supposed to tell them? The Sunday evening messages showed a different Sarah, one I hadn't seen since the early days of our marriage. 7:30 p.m. David, I'm scared. I don't understand what's happening. Can we please just talk? 8:45 p.m. I made mistakes, but this isn't fair. I never wanted to hurt you. 9:52 p.m. I keep thinking about our first apartment, when we were so happy with so little. Maybe we can find that again. 11:15 p.m. I love you. I know I haven't acted like it, but I do. Please don't throw away 7 years. Monday brought a new wave of desperation. 6 a.m. I slept in my car last night. The hotel kicked me out. This has gone too far. 7:30 a.m. I'm outside your office. Please come down so we can talk. People are staring. 8:15 a.m. Security asked me to leave the building. David, what have we become? That afternoon, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Sarah calling from Jessica's phone. David, this is insane, she said, her voice shaky and strained. I haven't eaten a real meal in 2 days. I'm staying in my car. Do you want me to starve? Sarah, you have a job, I replied calmly. You make decent commissions from real estate sales. You can take care of yourself. You know I haven't closed any deals in 6 weeks, she said, desperation creeping into her voice. All my money was going into our joint account. I don't have access to anything. That was a lie, and we both knew it. The evidence I'd found showed she'd been systematically moving money to a separate account for months, but apparently she'd already spent most of it on her expensive lifestyle changes. Sarah, I'm sure your attorney will explain your options during the emergency hearing on Wednesday. Emergency hearing? The one where you'll need to account for the $12,000 you moved from our joint savings account over the past 4 months and the $8,000 in credit card charges for non-essential purchases during the same period. The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. David, she finally whispered, I never meant for it to go this far. I was confused, making bad decisions. Jessica convinced me that I deserved better, but I see now that I already had everything I needed. You're right, I agreed. You did have everything you needed. You chose to throw it away for something that was never real. Tuesday's messages showed a complete breakdown of the confident woman who'd sent me a divorce text just 5 days earlier. 5:30 a.m. I called my parents. They're horrified. They want to know what I did to destroy our marriage. 7:45 a.m. Jessica won't return my calls. I think her husband found out about everything. 10:20 a.m. I tried to go back to Morrison & Associates. They said I'm on indefinite leave while they review my conduct. 12:15 p.m. David, I'm begging you. I know I made terrible mistakes, but please don't destroy me completely. 2:30 p.m. I keep thinking about our wedding day, how happy we were. You promised to love me forever. 4:45 p.m. I found the messages you must have seen. I understand why you're angry, but I never actually went through with most of Jessica's plans. 6 p.m. I'm sitting in our old spot by the lake where you proposed. Do you remember what you said about always being a team? 8:30 p.m. I threw away the most important thing in my life for people who don't even care about me. I'm so sorry. That night, for the first time since this whole situation began, I felt a flicker of the old sympathy I used to have for Sarah when she made impulsive decisions. But then I remembered the systematic way she documented our assets, the months of lies, the cold calculation behind her divorce announcement. The woman sending me these desperate messages wasn't the real Sarah any more than the gold-digging schemer had been. She was simply whatever version of herself she thought would get her what she wanted in the moment. Wednesday's emergency hearing would reveal which version would show up to court. Tuesday evening brought an unexpected development that changed everything I thought I knew about Sarah's situation. A man named Michael Martinez called my cell phone around 7 p.m., introducing himself as Jessica's husband. Mr. Anderson, I believe we need to talk, he said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that comes from discovering unpleasant truths. I have information that I think you'll find very interesting about what our wives have been planning. We agreed to meet Wednesday morning at a coffee shop downtown, 2 hours before my emergency court hearing. Michael turned out to be a tall, well-dressed man in his early 40s with the kind of tired eyes that suggested he'd been dealing with his own marital problems for some time. I found out about Jessica's little divorce consultation business completely by accident, he said, sliding a manila folder across the table. She left her laptop open last week, and I saw messages from not just your wife, but 3 other women. Apparently, she's been running a side operation, helping dissatisfied wives plan strategic divorces for a percentage of their settlements. The folder contained printouts that made my blood run cold. Jessica hadn't just been advising Sarah. She'd been coaching multiple women through elaborate schemes to maximize their divorce payouts while minimizing their husbands' rights. The operation was sophisticated, with standardized advice about hiding assets, manufacturing grounds for spousal support, and even recommendations for specific attorneys who were known to be aggressive in protecting women's interests. Your wife was actually one of Jessica's more conservative cases, Michael continued grimly. Some of these other women were planning to file false domestic violence claims, hide significant assets in offshore accounts, or even relocate children to different states before filing for divorce. The most disturbing documents show Jessica's fee structure, 20% of any settlement over $100,000, with bonuses for particularly large awards. She'd turned marriage destruction into a profitable business model. Why are you showing me this? I asked. Because Jessica destroyed my marriage too, Michael replied. She convinced my wife that I was financially controlling her because I questioned her spending habits. 3 years ago, Rebecca filed for divorce using Jessica's playbook. The only reason I found out about Jessica's involvement was because Rebecca felt guilty afterward and confessed everything. Did you reconcile? No, he said sadly. The damage was too extensive. But I did learn something important. Jessica targets women who are going through identity crises or feeling dissatisfied with their lives. She convinces them that their problems are their husband's fault and that divorce is the solution to all their unhappiness. Michael explained that Jessica's pattern was always the same. Identify vulnerable wives, usually women who'd recently started working in high-income environments or developed expensive tastes. Then systematically poison their perspectives on their marriages while providing tactical support for ending them profitably. The really sick part, Michael added, is that Jessica's own marriage is miserable. She treats this like a game, destroying other people's relationships because she can't fix her own. The evidence Michael provided was devastating. Jessica had been operating her informal divorce consulting business for over 4 years, with at least 15 women documented as clients. Several had paid her substantial fees from their divorce settlements, and Jessica had even written detailed guides on topics like maximizing spousal support claims and asset protection during marital dissolution. More importantly for my situation, the documents showed that Sarah's plan had been even more extensive than I'd realized. Jessica had advised her to quit her job after the divorce was finalized, claim she couldn't work due to emotional trauma, and seek both spousal support and a share of my business assets. The timeline showed Sarah was supposed to remain married to me for at least another year, while systematically documenting any behavior that could be used to claim emotional or financial abuse. Jessica told Sarah to keep a journal of every argument, every time you questioned her spending, every instance where you seemed controlling, Michael explained. She was building a case for claiming that you were emotionally abusive, which would have strengthened her position for both spousal support and asset division. The truly damaging evidence was in Jessica's communications with attorneys. She maintained relationships with several divorce lawyers who were known for aggressive tactics, and she'd been referring her clients to these attorneys while receiving kickbacks for successful cases. Mr. Anderson, Michael said as we prepared to leave, I want Jessica's operation exposed. I'm willing to testify about everything I've discovered, provide all this documentation, and help ensure that what happened to my marriage doesn't happen to anyone else. I arrived at the courthouse that morning with Margaret Chen and a briefcase full of evidence that I'd never expected to have. The emergency hearing was supposed to address Sarah's request to have the asset freezes lifted and to establish temporary spousal support. Instead, it was about to become something much larger. Sarah arrived 15 minutes late, looking like she'd slept in her car, which based on her recent messages, she probably had. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her designer clothes were wrinkled, and she'd clearly been crying. Behind her walked an attorney I didn't recognize, a thin man in an expensive suit who kept glancing nervously at the folder of documents Margaret was carrying. Your Honor, Margaret began, what we initially believed was a straightforward marital dissolution has revealed itself to be part of a larger pattern of fraud. We have evidence that Mrs. Anderson was receiving coaching from a third party who operates an illegal consulting business focused on helping wives maximize divorce settlements through deceptive practices. Sarah's attorney, who'd introduced himself as Robert Steinberg, immediately objected. Your Honor, this is a desperate attempt to deflect from Mr. Anderson's financial abuse of his client. Mrs. Anderson has been cut off from all marital resources and is currently homeless. Judge Morrison, a woman in her 60s with gray hair and no patience for theatrics, looked unimpressed. Mr. Steinberg, I've reviewed the temporary restraining orders, and they were issued based on evidence that Mrs. Anderson had been systematically moving marital assets while planning divorce proceedings. That's a serious allegation. Your Honor, Margaret continued, we now have documentation showing that Mrs. Anderson was following a detailed strategy designed by Jessica Martinez, who has been operating an unlicensed business coaching wives through strategic divorces for financial gain. When Margaret began presenting the evidence Michael had provided, I watched Sarah's face go through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, fear, and finally something that looked like betrayal. She clearly hadn't known about Jessica's broader operation, or the fact that she was just one of many women being manipulated for profit. The most damaging moment came when Margaret read from Jessica's written instructions to Sarah. Document every instance where your husband questions your decisions, shows concern about spending, or asks for explanations about your activities. These can all be reframed as controlling behaviors that justify both spousal support and a larger asset division. Judge Morrison's expression grew increasingly stern as more evidence was presented. Mrs. Anderson, she said finally, Were you aware that Ms. Martinez was charging fees for her advice and that she maintained financial arrangements with certain divorce attorneys? Sarah looked genuinely shocked. No, Your Honor. Jessica never mentioned any fees. She said she was helping me because we were friends. Mr. Steinberg, the judge continued. Did you have any prior contact with Ms. Martinez before taking on this case? Steinberg's face had gone pale. Your Honor, I may need to recuse myself from this case. I believe there may be a conflict of interest that I wasn't previously aware of. The hearing was recessed, while Steinberg consulted with his supervising partner. When court resumed 30 minutes later, he was no longer representing Sarah. Mrs. Anderson, Judge Morrison said, you now have the choice of representing yourself or requesting a continuance to find new counsel. However, given the evidence presented today about systematic asset manipulation and potential fraud, I'm maintaining all current restraining orders and adding additional requirements for financial transparency. Sarah chose to represent herself, which turned out to be a catastrophic decision. Without legal guidance, she made several admissions that Margaret later told me would be nearly impossible to overcome in final divorce proceedings. Your Honor, I did move some money to a separate account, but Jessica said all wives should have financial independence, Sarah said, apparently, not realizing she was admitting to exactly what she'd been accused of. I never meant to hide anything from David, she continued. I was just confused and scared about our future. Jessica made it seem like I needed to protect myself. The judge ordered Sarah to provide complete financial records for the past year, including documentation of all money moved from joint accounts and all expenses paid with marital funds. She also ordered both parties to attend mediation before any further court proceedings. As we left the courthouse, I saw Sarah sitting alone on a bench outside, crying quietly while she tried to call someone on her phone. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old protective instinct I'd once had for her. But then I remembered the months of lies, the systematic betrayal, and the cold calculation behind her divorce announcement. Margaret walked beside me as we headed to the parking garage. Mr. Anderson, this case just became much simpler for you and much more complicated for your wife. Her attorney's withdrawal combined with her admissions in court today have significantly strengthened your position. What happens next? Mrs. Anderson will need to find new representation, but any competent attorney will tell her that her best option is to negotiate a settlement that minimizes the damage from today's revelations. She's lost most of her leverage. That evening, my phone buzzed with a single message from Sarah. David, I know you probably hate me now, but I need you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. Jessica convinced me that you didn't really love me anymore, and that I needed to protect myself. I realize now that I was wrong about everything. For the first time since this nightmare began, I almost called her back. But then I remembered that Sarah had always been skilled at saying exactly what she thought people wanted to hear when she was in trouble. The woman who'd sent that divorce text 5 days earlier had made her choice. Now she was going to live with the consequences. The mediation was scheduled for the following Monday at Margaret's law firm. I arrived early, as was my habit, and spent the time reviewing the financial documents that would determine how the next phase of my life would unfold. Sarah's new attorney, Amanda Foster, had been recommended by the court as someone experienced in complex marital dissolutions, which was legal speak for cases involving potential fraud. Sarah arrived 10 minutes late, accompanied by attorney Foster, and looking like a completely different person from the confident woman who'd sent me that divorce text 2 weeks earlier. Her designer clothes had been replaced by a simple black dress that looked like it came from a department store clearance rack. Her usually perfect hair was styled simply, and she wore minimal makeup. Most tellingly, she kept her eyes down, avoiding any direct contact with me throughout the initial introductions. Before we begin, Margaret announced, I want to make clear that we've discovered additional evidence of financial misconduct that wasn't available during last week's hearing. She placed a thick folder on the conference table. Our forensic accountant has completed a full audit of all marital accounts for the past 12 months. Mrs. Anderson, your systematic transfer of funds began 8 months ago, not 4 as previously documented. The total amount improperly moved from joint accounts is $18,000, not the $12,000 we initially calculated. Attorney Foster looked uncomfortable as she reviewed the new documentation. Mrs. Anderson, why didn't you tell me about these additional transfers? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. I forgot about some of them. Jessica said small amounts wouldn't matter, that David would never notice. Mrs. Anderson, Margaret continued, our investigation also revealed that you used marital funds to pay for Miss Martinez's services despite claiming you were unaware she charged fees. The room went silent as Margaret produced copies of credit card statements showing payments totaling $3,200 to something called JM Consulting Services over a 6-month period. Sarah's face went completely white. Jessica said those were payments for a business course she was teaching. She never told me it was specifically about divorce planning. A business course called Strategic Life Transitions for Women, Margaret read from the documentation. The course description, which we obtained from Miss Martinez's business registration documents, explicitly states that it focuses on optimizing outcomes during marital dissolution. Attorney Foster sat down her pen and looked directly at Sarah. Mrs. Anderson, I need to speak with you privately before we continue. They stepped out of the conference room for nearly 20 minutes. When they returned, Foster looked like someone who'd just received very bad news. My client is prepared to make a settlement offer, Foster announced. What followed was the complete collapse of every advantage Sarah thought she'd had. The evidence of systematic financial deception, combined with her payments to Jessica's illegal consulting business, had destroyed any claim she might have had to spousal support. Worse, the court could potentially require her to pay restitution for the money she'd improperly moved and spent. "Mrs. Anderson," Margaret said, "our settlement offer is as follows. You will return the full $18,000 moved from joint accounts plus interest. You will also reimburse Mr. Anderson for the $3,200 paid to Miss Martinez's consulting service, since those payments were made without his knowledge or consent using marital funds." Sarah started crying quietly, but Margaret wasn't finished. "You will receive no spousal support. Given the evidence of financial misconduct, you will retain your personal vehicle and personal belongings, but you forfeit any claim to the marital home, Mr. Anderson's business assets, or his retirement accounts." "This is too harsh," Foster protested. "My client made mistakes, but she shouldn't be left with nothing." "Your client," Margaret replied coldly, "spent 8 months systematically stealing from her husband while planning to destroy his financial security through a fraudulent divorce scheme. She's fortunate we're not pursuing criminal charges for theft and conspiracy." The next 2 hours were brutal to watch. Sarah, who just 3 weeks earlier had been confident that she could manipulate me into a favorable settlement, was forced to confront the reality that her calculated betrayal had backfired completely. "David," she said during a brief recess, approaching me for the first time since the mediation began, "please, I know I made terrible mistakes, but $21,000? I don't have that kind of money. I'll be ruined." "You should have thought about that before you started planning to ruin me," I replied. "I never wanted to ruin you," she insisted, tears streaming down her face. "Jessica convinced me that you were planning to leave me anyway, that I needed to protect myself. She showed me statistics about how divorced women end up in poverty, and I got scared. So you decided to make sure I'd be the one in poverty instead." "No," Sarah's voice cracked. "I just wanted security. I wanted to know I'd be okay if everything fell apart. But I see now that I'm the one who made everything fall apart." "Sarah," I said, feeling exhausted by the whole situation, "for 8 months, you lied to me every single day. You took pictures of my private business documents. You moved our money while I was working overtime to pay for your shopping trips. You planned this divorce like it was a business acquisition." "I know," she whispered. "I know, and I hate myself for it. Jessica made it all seem so reasonable, like I was just being smart and practical. But I see now that I was being selfish and cruel." The final settlement was even harsher than Margaret's initial offer. Sarah would have to repay the full $21,200 over 18 months, with the payments coming directly from her paychecks before she received them. She would retain her car and personal belongings, but she forfeited all claims to any other marital assets. Most significantly, the settlement included a clause stating that if Sarah failed to make the required payments or violated any terms of the agreement, I could pursue both civil and criminal charges for theft and fraud. "Mrs. Anderson," Foster said, after reviewing the final documents, "I strongly advise you to accept this settlement. Given the evidence against you, a judge would likely impose even harsher terms, and there's a real possibility of criminal prosecution." Sarah signed the papers with shaking hands, her tears making small wet spots on the legal documents that would officially end our 7-year marriage. As everyone prepared to leave, Sarah approached me one last time. "David, I need you to know something," she said, her voice steadier than it had been all day. "When I sent you that divorce text, I thought I was being strong and independent. I thought I was taking control of my life, but the truth is I was being controlled by someone else's agenda the whole time." "What do you mean?" "Jessica never cared about me or my happiness," Sarah continued. "She saw me as a mark, someone she could manipulate for profit. Everything she told me about deserving better, about you not appreciating me, about needing to protect myself financially, it was all designed to make me do exactly what I did. Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I want you to understand that the woman who destroyed our marriage wasn't really me. It was some twisted version of me that Jessica created by feeding my insecurities and fears. The real me loved you, loved our life together, and would never have hurt you like this." I looked at Sarah. Really looked at her for the first time in months without her expensive clothes and perfect styling. She looked younger, more vulnerable, and strangely more like the woman I'd married 7 years earlier. "Sarah," I said finally, "I believe that you were manipulated. I believe that Jessica took advantage of your insecurities and led you down a path you never should have taken. But here's what I can't forgive. You made a choice every single day for 8 months to lie to me, to steal from me, and to plan my destruction. Jessica didn't force you to do those things. She just made them seem reasonable." "You're right," Sarah said, nodding slowly. "I made those choices. I own them, and I accept the consequences. I just hope that someday, when enough time has passed, you might remember that there was a time when I loved you more than anything in the world." "I do remember that time," I replied. "That's what makes this so heartbreaking." 3 days later, the divorce was finalized. Judge Morrison signed the decree with unusual speed, commenting that the case served as an excellent example of how deception and fraud in marital relationships serve no one's interests. "The State Attorney General's office has opened an investigation into Jessica's consulting business," he reported. "Apparently, 3 other men whose wives were Jessica's clients have come forward with similar evidence. She's likely facing charges for operating an unlicensed business, consumer fraud, and potentially racketeering." if they can prove the scope of her operation. What about the attorneys who were working with her? 2 of them have been suspended pending investigation by the State Bar Association. The third one, Robert Steinberg, the guy who tried to represent your wife, has already been disbarred for accepting kickbacks from non-attorney consultants. The final piece of justice came 2 weeks later when Jessica's husband filed for divorce, using evidence of her fraudulent business activities to secure a favorable settlement. According to Michael, Jessica lost everything, her house, her car, and most of her assets, in addition to facing potential criminal charges. Turns out, Michael told me, Jessica's been living way beyond her means for years, funding her lifestyle with money from her divorce consulting scheme. When that income disappeared, and her husband left her, she couldn't maintain any of it. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this whole nightmare began. Closure. The woman who had poisoned my wife's mind and destroyed my marriage was facing consequences that matched the damage she'd caused. Sarah, meanwhile, had moved into a small apartment across town and taken a job at a different real estate company, one that focused on modest homes for first-time buyers rather than luxury properties for wealthy clients. According to mutual friends, she was making her payments on schedule and seemed to be rebuilding her life with a humility that had been absent during her final months as my wife. I never saw or spoke to her again after the mediation, but I occasionally wondered if she'd learned anything from the experience or if she'd simply found new ways to avoid taking responsibility for her choices. Either way, it was no longer my problem to solve. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I found myself in a surprisingly good place. The house felt more like home than it had in years, probably because I could finally relax without wondering what financial surprise might be waiting in our next credit card statement. I'd used some of the money Sarah was paying back to renovate the kitchen, something we'd talked about doing together for years but could never afford because of her expensive shopping habits. My business was thriving in ways I hadn't expected. Word had somehow gotten out about my situation, and I'd received several referrals from other men going through divorces who wanted an accountant who understood the importance of protecting assets during marital dissolution. It was a niche I'd never considered, but it turned out there was significant demand for financial professionals who specialized in divorce preparation and recovery. Margaret Chen had referred me to 3 other attorneys who handled complex divorce cases, and I'd become something of an expert in forensic accounting for marital disputes. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah's betrayal had inadvertently led me to discover a lucrative specialty that I genuinely enjoyed. More importantly, I'd started dating again. Nothing serious, just dinner dates and casual relationships with women I met through work or social activities. After 7 years of walking on eggshells around Sarah's increasingly volatile moods and expensive demands, it was refreshing to spend time with people who were genuinely content with simple pleasures like hiking, cooking at home, or watching movies without constantly checking their phones for social media validation. One woman, Rachel, was a teacher at the local elementary school who drove a 10-year-old Honda and was perfectly happy splitting the check at casual restaurants. After months of dates where Sarah would spend more on a single outfit than Rachel spent on groceries in a month, the contrast was both striking and appealing. "You seem surprised that I'm okay with Dutch treat," Rachel commented during our 3rd date at a small Italian place downtown. "My ex-wife convinced me that paying for everything was what husbands were supposed to do," I replied. "That sounds exhausting," Rachel said simply. "I make my own money. Why wouldn't I pay my own way?" It was such a basic concept, but after years of being Sarah's personal ATM, it felt revolutionary. The payments from Sarah arrived like clockwork every month. When $1,177.78 was deposited directly into my account on the 15th, Margaret had structured the agreement so that the money came from Sarah's employer before she ever saw it, ensuring that she couldn't spend it on something else and then claim she couldn't make her obligation. According to mutual friends, Sarah was living a dramatically different life. Gone were the expensive clothes, luxury cars, and upscale restaurants. She'd moved into a modest apartment complex near her new job and was driving a used Toyota that looked like it had seen better days. More significantly, she'd apparently cut all ties with the social circle that had revolved around expensive activities and status competitions. "She seems different," my friend Tom reported after running into Sarah at a grocery store. "Quieter, more serious. She asked about you, by the way. What did she want to know? Whether you were doing okay? If you were seeing anyone? I told her you seemed happy, and that it wasn't really her business anymore. How did she react to that?" She just nodded and said she was glad you were doing well. Then she mentioned that she'd learned some hard lessons about what really matters in life. I didn't ask Tom for more details. Whatever lessons Sarah was learning, she needed to learn them without my involvement or approval. The most satisfying update came from Michael Martinez, who'd become an unlikely friend through our shared experience with Jessica's manipulation schemes. The state's investigation into Jessica's business had expanded into a full-scale operation involving multiple agencies. They found evidence that Jessica was running similar operations in 3 other states, Michael told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings. She'd been operating under different business names, but the pattern was identical. Target vulnerable wives, coach them through strategic divorces, collect percentage fees from settlements. How many women were involved? At least 47 that they've identified so far. The total amount of money involved is over $2 million. She was running what essentially amounted to a criminal enterprise focused on marriage destruction. Jessica had been indicted on multiple felony charges, including racketeering, fraud, and operating an unlicensed business. Her trial was scheduled for the following spring, and prosecutors were confident they had enough evidence to secure significant prison time. The really sad part, Michael continued, is that most of her clients ended up worse off than they would have been if they'd just filed for normal divorces. Jessica's strategies were so aggressive and deceptive that they usually backfired, leaving the women with less money and damaged reputations. What about the attorneys who were working with her? 2 of them have been disbarred, and the 3rd is facing criminal charges. Turns out the kickback scheme was more extensive than anyone realized. Jessica was essentially buying legal representation for her clients and then charging them inflated fees. The conversation reminded me of something I'd been thinking about frequently. How many other marriages had been destroyed by Jessica's interference, and how many men like me had been blindsided by wives who'd been systematically turned against them. Michael, I said, do you ever wonder if your wife would have filed for divorce anyway, even without Jessica's influence? Every day, he admitted. But I've come to believe that it doesn't matter. The woman I married wouldn't have used Jessica's tactics. She wouldn't have hidden money, lied about her intentions, or tried to destroy me financially. Jessica didn't just convince her to get divorced. She convinced her to become someone I didn't recognize. That's exactly how I feel about Sarah. The thing is, Michael continued, I think Jessica targeted women who were already unhappy but didn't have the courage to address their problems directly. She gave them permission to act on their worst impulses while convincing them they were being smart and strategic. 1 year after the divorce was finalized, I was shopping at the farmer's market downtown, something I'd started doing again after Sarah left, since she'd considered it beneath her during her final months as my wife. I was examining apples at a vendor's stall when I heard a familiar voice behind me. David. I turned around to find Sarah standing a few feet away, looking almost exactly like the woman I'd married 8 years earlier. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater. Her hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail, and she carried a canvas shopping bag instead of a designer purse. Hello, Sarah, I said, surprised by how normal the encounter felt. I wasn't sure if you'd want to talk to me, she said, her voice tentative but steady. It's fine, I replied. How are you doing? Better than I deserve to be, she said with a small, sad smile. I'm working at Hometown Realty now, helping first-time buyers find houses they can actually afford. It's different from what I was doing before, but it feels more honest. We walked together through the market, maintaining a careful distance but falling into the kind of easy conversation we used to have during the early years of our marriage. David, I need to tell you something, Sarah said as we stopped near the flower vendors. I've been in therapy for the past 6 months, trying to understand how I became the person who could do those things to you. What have you learned? That I was looking for someone to blame for my own unhappiness, she said. Jessica didn't create my dissatisfaction with our life. She just convinced me that you were the reason for it, and that destroying our marriage was the solution. And now? Now I understand that I was the problem. I stopped appreciating what we had and started obsessing over what we didn't have. I let someone else's agenda convince me that I deserved more than what we'd built together. We continued walking in comfortable silence until we reached the end of the market. David, Sarah said finally, I know it's too late for us, and I'm not asking for forgiveness or another chance, but I want you to know that losing you was the biggest mistake of my life. You were a good husband, and I threw that away for reasons that seem insane to me now. Sarah, I replied, choosing my words carefully, I appreciate you saying that, I really do, but I need you to understand something. The problem wasn't that you wanted more from life. The problem was how you went about trying to get it. I know, she said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I chose deception over honesty, manipulation over communication. I treated our marriage like it was something to be exploited rather than something to be treasured. What I still don't understand, I said, is why you couldn't just talk to me about whatever you were feeling. We used to be able to discuss anything. Because I knew you'd try to fix things, Sarah replied. You'd suggest compromises, budget adjustments, maybe a part-time job for me to earn money for the things I wanted. You'd be reasonable and practical, and I didn't want reasonable and practical. I wanted to be angry and resentful and blame someone else for my problems. It was the most honest thing she'd said during our entire marriage crisis. Jessica gave me permission to be selfish, Sarah continued. She told me I deserved everything I wanted without having to work for it or sacrifice for it. She made it seem like taking what I wanted from you was actually empowerment. And now? Now I understand that real empowerment means taking responsibility for your own happiness instead of expecting someone else to provide it for you. As we prepared to part ways, Sarah reached into her shopping bag and pulled out a small envelope. This is the final payment, she said, handing it to me. I know it's not due for another 6 months, but I got a bonus at work and I wanted to finish this obligation early. I looked at the envelope, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Sarah, you don't have to do this now. Yes, I do, she said firmly. Carrying this debt has been a daily reminder of what I did to you, to us, to everything we built together. I need to close that chapter completely. What will you do now? Keep working, keep learning, keep trying to become someone I can respect, she said. Maybe someday I'll find someone who can love the person I'm becoming instead of the person I was pretending to be. I hope you do, I said, and I meant it. As I watched Sarah walk away through the farmer's market, carrying her simple canvas bag and looking more like her authentic self than she had in years. I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. The divorce had cost both of us more than money. It had destroyed a 7-year partnership, damaged our faith in relationships, and forced us both to confront uncomfortable truths about who we really were. But it had also freed us from a situation that had become toxic and unsustainable. Sarah had learned that the grass isn't always greener on the other side, especially when you burn down your own lawn to get there. I had learned that standing up for myself, even when it meant fighting someone I loved, was sometimes the only way to maintain my self-respect and dignity. Jessica Martinez was eventually sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for racketeering and fraud. Her divorce consulting operation had destroyed dozens of marriages and left a trail of financial and emotional devastation across multiple states. The judge noted during sentencing that Jessica had weaponized the institution of marriage for personal profit, showing callous disregard for the families and children affected by her schemes. Michael Martinez remarried 2 years later to a woman who worked as a nurse and had no interest in expensive restaurants or luxury vacations. I learned to appreciate someone whose idea of a perfect evening is cooking dinner together and watching Netflix, he told me at his wedding reception. Sarah eventually found work at a nonprofit organization that helped low-income families navigate the home buying process. According to mutual friends, she seemed genuinely happy in a life that bore no resemblance to the luxury lifestyle she'd once pursued. She never remarried, but she appeared to have found the kind of peace that comes from living authentically, rather than trying to impress others. As for me, I married Rachel 3 years after my divorce was finalized. Our wedding was a small affair at a local park, followed by a reception in my backyard. The total cost was less than what Sarah used to spend on a single shopping trip, but it was perfect because it reflected who we actually were, rather than who we thought we should be. The house that had once been filled with tension and expensive objects that never brought happiness became a home filled with laughter, books, and the kind of comfortable contentment that comes from being with someone who values you for who you are, rather than what you can provide. Sometimes when I'm working in the garden that Rachel and I planted together, or when we're cooking dinner while discussing our simple plans for the weekend, I think about the text message that changed everything. David, I want a divorce. I can't do this anymore. In the end, Sarah was right about one thing. She couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't maintain the pretense that she was happy with our life together while secretly resenting everything about it. The tragedy wasn't that our marriage ended, but that it took such a destructive path to get there. The woman who sent me that divorce text taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them go, even when they're trying to take everything else with them. And sometimes the most important thing you can do for yourself is to stand up and fight for your dignity, even when it means fighting someone you once loved more than anything in the world. In the quiet moments of my new life, I'm grateful for both lessons.